So there was a man named Elam Brown, and he had been a farmer on the East Coast, not very successful. He moved west, was in Kentucky, or sort of different stories, but he had moved to the Midwest. And his wife died, and he had a son who went to the Oregon Territory and had written to his father and said, "You need to come west. There's fertile land, you can grow crops all through the year." And so, as in this time, a lot of people who were making that westward journey went to usually Missouri. And so they gathered a wagon train of 13 or 14 families. One of the other families was the Allen family, Margaret and Isaac and 11 children. And we're not sure if all of the children were along on the journey. So on May 1st, 1846, they started west. They traveled about 10 miles a day. They had covered wagons filled with possessions and things they might need to start a new life. And most of the people walked, or occasionally rode horses, but I think almost everybody who was not a baby or a really old person would have walked. So our particular group went about 10 miles a day, ended up in California. They were intending to go to Oregon, but for one circumstance or another. Margaret's husband died on the way, so when Elam and Margaret got to the Sacramento Valley, they married. They were early 50s probably, and spent a year or so in this area. He was a logger, so he was up in the redwoods in Oakland, and heard about this particular piece of land called Rancho Acalanes that was about 3,300 acres. It had been given to a Mexican soldier after the Mexican War against Spain in 1822, and went to a man named Leidesdorf, who was a financier in San Francisco and wanted to sell it. So Elam Brown bought it for $900, and so that's kind of how Lafayette got started in 1847. What I know about the indigenous people, they were called the Saklan. They were a tribelet of the Miwoks, and they were basically hunter-gatherers, lived in this area. Principal diet staple was acorns. They made acorn mush. They probably also hunted and fished, and they lived in this area until the Spanish explorers came and the missions. So our native people either went to the missions and were very unhappy or mistreated, or they moved away, or a lot of them died from the diseases that the Spanish brought.
What do you think the early European settlers, let's call them, European origin settlers, what attracted them to this area? What was rich about it?
The land, the farmland. Early on, Contra Costa County was the biggest wheat producing county in the state. So there was fertile farmland, and if you look at old pictures, you see there weren't a lot of trees, there weren't a lot of houses or buildings. It was just open farmland. So I think that's what attracted people. The fact that you could farm year round and you didn't have to deal with snow and freezing and things like that. Well, I think the thing that really changed this area the most was probably 1937, because the Caldecott Tunnel, the Broadway low-level tunnel, was built and opened, and the same year the Bay Bridge opened. And so that really opened up this, because there were people who had summer cottages here who lived in Oakland and Berkeley, and you would drive over the hills or through the old Kennedy Tunnel, which was above where the Caldecott is now. And so it took a long time. So once the roads were built, the tunnel was built, the bridge was built, people could live here and work in Oakland or Berkeley or even the city. So I think that's what really changed. And then the post-war boom, the GI Bill. My dad fought in the war, and my great-grandfather had bought property here in the 30s, and so he sold my dad a lot over between the freeway and the high school. And so, we built a house. I think I was about 1 year old then. And, it was affordable. You could get financial help. And so I think suddenly you could live here and work elsewhere. And it was just a nice place to be. I remember when the freeway was built, I remember going up to the construction sites right by Pleasant Hill Road. My dad would walk up there and we got to sit on all the big tractors and things. I can remember the downtown area. where Manja is now, that area. The FedEx store, there was a grocery store called Lafayette Foods. I can remember that. I remember Sutton's shoes, because Al Sutton was, my dad worked at the high school, and I remember he was the basketball player. He was the son of the owner. But I just don't have a lot of recollection of little everyday details. It was a very idyllic life. I mean, I rode bikes with friends. We went all over the place and nobody worried about us. We had horses on the hillside, so my great aunt has a family pool over where we lived. And we'd swim in the summer, and then we'd chase the horses down the hill and ride around the subdivision in our bathing suits. I don't think kids would get to do that these days. So it was a very innocent life, kind of. I remember when they built Spring Hill School. I started off at Montecito, which is White Pony today. And then when I got to 4th grade, they had just built Spring Hill School. So I went there for 2 or 3 years. And then to Stanley and then Doc Lonnie's. But just all the stuff that kids did in those days. We played outside, we did lots of sports. There was very little television at that point. So we had to entertain ourselves. So I had 2 brothers, and we played basketball against the neighbor boys, and we spent a lot more time out of doors than kids do today, for sure. But I think it was a fairly safe time. But it's hard to remember the big stuff. I know my parents were very active, kind of, where they're talking about putting those, Measure L. That was, they were going to put a rock quarry in there, and my mom was really against that. So she went to a lot of city council meetings. And then when they were going to put Camino Diablo in, that road that goes up by goes up the hill where the corporation yard is. And there's a big, beautiful oak tree, and they were going to put the road right through the oak tree, and my mom went and fought that so they'd leave the oak tree, which is still there. Before incorporation, because I know this because I'm on the board of the Lafayette Improvement Association, which acted as the city council before incorporation, and so they dealt with all sorts of problems like roads and drains and sewers and all that stuff that the city would deal with now. And I think there were people who were really involved in the everyday workings of the city, because that was the only way things happened. I think they weren't able to be as reliant on the county because the county had a lot of other communities to deal with. So before incorporation, I think people just had to do more because there was no one else who was going to do it. And I think now that maybe it's changed a little bit and everybody looks to the city to solve all the problems, and it's a big job. Just be active in your community. Just take an interest if it's the chamber, if it's the school district, if it's other thing. I mean, city council. Try to put your 2 cents in and try to be helpful, because really it's a community that makes a community.